She was intelligent, she was witty, she was cultured, she was urbane, she knew how to dance, she knew how to dress, she knew how to decorate, she knew how to entertain, she knew how to hold a conversation. She was a perfect first lady. If only she wasn't. Or was she? Remember, ladies, we're not here to judge nor to diagnose, but to wonder and to speculate on how one of our sisters from the past had lived her so-called life. Born Mary Todd on December 13, 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky, she was the fourth of the 7 children of her father, Robert Smith Todd, a banker, a lawyer, and a politician, and her mother, Elizabeth Parker Todd, an upper-class Southern housewife. Sadly, Mary would face her first loss at the age of 6, when her mother died of bacterial infection a few days after childbirth. Her father took Betsy Humphrey as his second wife, and together they had 9 more children. Mary and her other full-blooded siblings would never get along with their stepmother, who once called Mary Satan's limb. Elizabeth Todd, her eldest sister, who was a mother to her and her siblings at some point when their mother died, got married at 16 to the son of Illinois' first governor and happily moved to Springfield, its new capital. Mary, only 11 at the time, would later describe those years growing up in one word: desolate. Despite this difficulty, Mary lived a privileged childhood. Her family was wealthy and they owned enslaved people who did all of the most difficult housework. Though her father was seldom home, it's very important for him that all his daughters receive a good education. This is something commendable since it was considered unacceptable at the time for women to be overly educated. Robert enrolled Mary when she was 9 at Shelby Female Academy, where she studied grammar, reading, writing, math, science, history, geography, French, and religion. She attended the school for 5 years and was an outstanding student. Many girls at her age would have been already satisfied, but Mary was not. She then entered Madame Mentel's for young ladies, the best finishing school in Lexington, to continue her education. And since their house became more and more crowded with new half-siblings occurring every 2 years, Mary chose to board at school where she thrived and was happy, returning home only on weekends. Here, she studied French, dance, drama, music, and the manners and responsibilities of an upper-class lady. When she graduated, she had a glowing reputation as a lively and intelligent young woman who is fluent in French and with a head for politics. Young Mary was quoted saying that she wishes to live in the White House someday. Well, what can I say? Be careful what you wish for. In October 1839, when she was 21, Mary moved to Springfield, Illinois to live with her sister Elizabeth at their beautiful mansion, perched on Springfield's aristocracy hill, overlooking the town. She could have moved there 2 years earlier when she was 19, after she finished school at Mentel's, but Frances, her second eldest sister, was already living there, and at that time, Elizabeth and her husband couldn't afford to support 2 sisters in their house, so she was able to move in only after Frances got married to a successful pharmacist and moved out. During that time, people would describe Mary as not only had a quick intellect, but an intuitive judgment of men and their motives. Ordinarily, she was affable and even charming in her manners, but when offended or antagonized, she could be very bitter and sarcastic. Elizabeth introduced Mary to people in the best political circles. She was courted by several rising political figures, including Stephen A. Douglas, but she ultimately fell for Abraham Lincoln, the struggling young lawyer occupying a seat in the Illinois state legislature at the time, and whose characteristics and background couldn't be any more different from her. He was tall and lanky, she was short and round, he exuded calmness and patience, she was temperamental, and once described as having a personality like an April day, sunning all over with laughter one moment, the next crying. He was born and raised in a one-room log cabin. She was raised in a 5,500 square feet, 14-room Georgian-style house. Abraham received less than 1 year of formal schooling. Mary received education throughout her childhood. In everything, Mary Todd was the exact reverse of Abraham Lincoln. Despite these opposite backgrounds, they met one night at a dance in Springfield, Illinois. Abraham approached Mary and told her that he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. As she later related the story, said he did just that, danced with her in the worst way. She overlooked his 2 left feet and they began dating. Though it wasn't love at first sight, they developed their relationship from friendship and bonded with their mutual interest in politics. However, Frances, her second oldest sister, who was the first to consider dating Abraham when she was still single, but wasn't smitten, was not impressed with the relationship and referred to Abraham as the plainest man in Springfield. Her eldest sister, Elizabeth, and her husband disapproved of the uncultured Mr. Lincoln. She had warned Mary that she and Abraham were not suitable. They were so different that they could not live happily as man and wife. Even so, Elizabeth was kind enough to invite Abraham often to their home where he and Mary would sit in the parlor and talk. Abraham would listen and gaze on Mary as if drawn by some irresistible superpower, as Elizabeth would later recall. So imagine Elizabeth's elation when the couple broke up in New Year's Day of 1841. Abraham ended the relationship that day when he caught Mary flirting with Edwin Webb upon arriving at the New Year's party. Abraham was supposed to escort Mary, but he was late to pick her up, so she went on to arrive first at the party. Mary responded to Abraham's rage by stomping her feet and shouting, "Go and never come back." The breakup took its toll on both parties, though. Abraham would miss the following 6 days in the legislature, and when he returned, he looked so reduced and emaciated. He said that he's the most miserable man living and must die or be better. Mary, on the other hand, would suffer in loneliness for months following. After a year of avoiding each other, the two slowly went back to each other's arms with the urging of a mutual friend. They rekindled their relationship and dated in secret until Abraham proposed. So, on a Friday on November 4, 1842, Mary, who was 24 years old, and Abraham Lincoln, 33, wed at the home of her sister Elizabeth in front of about 30 guests. It was then patterns began to emerge in their relationship that would play out almost daily for the rest of their time together. If Mary felt neglected by her husband, she would flirt with his colleagues to garner his attention. He would respond with indifference and focus his energy on the task at hand. Indeed, to outsiders, the only thing the two had in common was a political agenda. The couple lived in a place where they spent their first year of marriage, a single room on the second floor of a boarding house named the Globe Tavern. In those humble conditions, Mary gave birth to their first child on August 1, 1843, Robert Todd Lincoln, named after her father, Robert Todd. Many now couldn't help but speculate on the reason behind the hushed and rushed wedding that took place exactly 9 months prior to Robert's birth. After renting a small house for a time, Abraham Lincoln purchased his first and the only house he would ever own. In May of 1844, Abraham, Mary, and Robert moved into a 1.5-story cottage, a house which they eventually expanded into 2 stories, and a home where they lived as a family for the next 17 years. The house still stands up to this day, preserved and a National Historic Site. Some neighbors would attest to Mary's volatile behavior. According to one, Mary regularly assaulted Abraham with household objects: broomsticks, potatoes, pieces of stove wood, cups of hot coffee, sometimes striking him hard enough to draw blood. She seemed to take a special delight in contradicting her husband and humiliating him on every occasion, according to them. Abraham would later remark to friends on why he tolerated his wife's attacks. "If you knew how little harm it does me, and how much good it does her, you wouldn't wonder that I am meek," he once said. Mary gave birth to 3 more sons in the next decade: Edward Baker in 1846, William Wallace in 1850, and Thomas, or Tad, in 1853. Edward died of tuberculosis at the age of 4, the first of many tragedies that would haunt Mary in her adult life. Edward's death sent her into a depression. She would struggle with bouts of depression for the rest of her life. Mary managed the Lincoln family home while Abraham pursued his increasingly successful legal career. It could be a lonely work. Abraham sometimes traveled for months at a time. When Abraham ran against Stephen A. Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858, Mary supported his campaign, even though his views on slavery caused tension within her slave-holding family. Mary enjoyed reading a wide range of subjects. Often reviewing a book for Abraham, he would say that he had no need to read the book after Mary gave him a synopsis. He had great respect for her judgment and never took an important step without consulting her. Her influence on him was apparent, for when Abraham learned he won the presidential election in 1860, he quickly dashed home and told his supporters that there is a little short woman there that is more interested in this matter than I am. He then exclaimed in excitement, "Mary, Mary, we are elected!" When Mary moved to the White House in 1861, she assumed the role of First Lady of the United States. As First Lady, she was responsible for socially supporting all of her husband's political work, creating a welcoming environment for political allies and foes alike. Even her own family was torn apart, for several of her brothers joined the Confederate Army, the 11 southern states that seceded from the U.S. government. Through it all, Mary never wavered in her support of Abraham, believing wholeheartedly in his mission in abolishing slavery while keeping the nation together. She was the only First Lady who had to manage this daunting task as the nation tore itself apart. For the Lincoln's presidential term was plagued with a civil war. She supported the war effort by visiting hospitals and comforting the troops. She took the time to write letters for them to send to their loved ones. From time to time, she accompanied her husband on military visits to the field to boost morale. Mary also threw herself into a project, redecorating the White House and doing her best to elevate the social scene. Many politicians in Washington criticized her efforts as frivolous, and even Abraham became angry when her renovations went way over budget. Mary struggled to find a balance between the role that was expected of her and the terrible realities facing the country. Her eagerness to accept extravagant gifts from office seekers, furs, diamonds, a luxuriously appointed couch, didn't help her and caused repeated scandals. Mary's struggle to be the First Lady her nation needed was compounded by the death of her 11-year-old son William to typhoid fever in 1862. She was overcome with depression and didn't leave her bed for months. Mary had also been suffering from severe headaches, described as migraines, throughout her adult life, but it seemed to become more frequent in the White House. Abraham hired a nurse to care for her. Mary eventually recovered from the depression after losing her son, but her illness was not viewed with sympathy by a public that was receiving daily dispatches about the tragic losses at the battlefront. Once again, Mary was criticized for failing to live up to what seems to be impossible standards. None of her efforts were considered enough. She soon earned a reputation as the most unpopular First Lady in American history. John Nicolay and John Hay, Lincoln's main White House secretaries, called her the Hellcat and her Satanic Majesty in their private correspondence. For in late March 1865, when President Lincoln made an extended battlefield visit to encourage wary U.S. Army troops as they prepared a final assault on Richmond, the Confederate capital, Mary accompanied her husband, as she sometimes did in the past. But during this time, several witnesses recounted the outrageous behavior she displayed during her agonizing 8-day stay. At one point, Mary scolded Julia Grant, the wife of General Ulysses S. Grant, like an empress would scold a commoner for sitting down while the First Lady stood. "How dare you be seated until I invite you?" she barked, a journalist recounted. The spirited Mrs. Grant replied that if Mrs. Lincoln was the wife of the president, she was the wife of the general in command of the armies of the United States, and that she would sit down anywhere if she thought it more agreeable than to stand in anyone's presence. Mary was left seething. From then on, she treated Mrs. Grant with an icy disdain. She also would explode on one incident at Major Adam Badu, the one who escorted her on a battlefield tour, when he mentioned that the wife of General Charles Griffin had received a presidential permit to remain at the front when the fighting began. "Do you mean to say that she saw the president alone?" Mary shrieked at him. "Do you know that I never allowed the president to see any woman alone?" She ranted until General George Meade convinced her that it was the Secretary of War, not the President himself, who had issued Sally Griffin's pass. During the same tour, Mary Mercer Ord, the wife of General Edward Ord and an accomplished horsewoman, chose to ride with the men rather than in the cramped ambulance carriage with the First Lady. When Mary caught sight of Mrs. Ord's horse prancing alongside the President's steed, her rage was beyond all bounds. "What does the woman mean by riding by the side of the president and ahead of me?" she screeched. Does she suppose that Abraham wants her by the side of him? Mary Ord, with Julia Grant's help, attempted to apologize for an unintended affront, but Mary insulted and called her vile names in the presence of a crowd of officers and asked what she meant by following the president. The poor woman burst into tears, but Mary refused to be appeased. At supper that night, she berated General Ord to the president and urged that he should be removed. For days thereafter, Mary would repeatedly attack her husband in the presence of officers because of Mrs. Griffin and Mrs. Ord. On April 14, 1865, though, Mary had every reason to believe that her life was improving. The war was drawing to a close, the US government was going to achieve a total victory, and her husband had just started his second term in office. Mary believed she would continue to spend Abraham's second presidential term supporting him in his efforts to rebuild the nation. But that fateful evening at Ford's Theater, while holding his husband's hand and watching a popular British comedy play, Our American Cousin, Abraham Lincoln was shot point blank at the back of his head. Together with them was Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, the daughter of U.S. Senator Ira Harris of New York. Lincoln beforehand urged General Grant to accompany them to the theater, hinting that the nation expected to see the victorious president and general united at such a moment, but his wife Julia objected strenuously to accompanying the president's wife. So the general had to make an excuse to the president on why they couldn't attend the play with them that evening. Other officials would also turn down the Lincolns' invitation. That's why they ended up going with Major Rathbone and his fiancée. The presidential party was seated in a box which was made up of two adjacent boxes. Just moments before, Mary asked Abraham lovingly, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" Where he replied, "She won't think anything about it." That would be the president's very last words, for 5 minutes later, his assassin would enter the presidential box. Major Rathbone leaped out of his chair and fought with the shooter, who then dropped the gun, pulled out a knife, and stabbed him in the left forearm. As the shooter prepared to leap from the box to the stage with a 12-foot drop, Major Rathbone again grabbed him. He managed to jump and escape though. A young government army surgeon, only 23 years old, named Charles A. Leal and just weeks out of medical school, had gone to the theater to get a glimpse of the president, ended up responding to Mary Todd Lincoln's cries for help. He had vaulted over rows of seats to gain entry to the presidential box to saw the president, who appeared to be dead. His eyes were closed and his head had fallen forward. He was being held upright in his chair by Mary, who was weeping bitterly. Leal had resuscitated Abraham Lincoln almost immediately, right there and then. He was then taken across the street to the Peterson house, where he was laid diagonally on one bed so the doctors summoned could work on trying to save his life. Major Rathbone was losing considerable amount of blood, which stained Clara Harris' white dress, face, and hands when she attempted to aid him. But despite being seriously wounded, he escorted the First Lady Mary across the street where the president was taken. Shortly after escorting Mary, he passed out due to loss of blood. Major Rathbone was taken home while Clara Harris decided to stay with Mary. Mary would be wailing and so unhinged with grief. Her visible anguish proved too disturbing for the stoic, mostly male circle of advisors gathered, and Secretary of War William Stanton ordered her out of the room, denying her the chance to be with her husband in his final moments. It was Robert Lincoln, their oldest son, who sat with Abraham throughout the night and to the following morning. Mary was allowed entry just few minutes before the president was declared dead at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. Upon returning to the White House a few hours later, Mary was unable to enter most of the mansion's rooms without painful reminders of her dead husband. She finally collapsed in a small spare bedroom where her wails, unearthly shrieks, and terrible convulsions would be heard from. Mary did not surface for the viewing of the president's coffin on April 18, nor for funeral services the following day. She allowed only a selected few, which includes her sons Robert and Tad, to enter her room. Those who saw her said that she looked more dead than alive, worn down by sickness and horror of that dreadful night. She received messages of condolences from all over the world, many of which she attempted to answer personally, including one from Queen Victoria of England. Amid her grief, Mary's characteristic assertiveness did not falter, for when he learned that officials of Springfield, Illinois planned to bury Abraham in a cemetery in the middle of the city, she insisted for him to be buried on a family plot in a quiet Springfield suburb. According to her, is a pastoral setting her husband would have preferred. The officials disagreed as they already spent a considerable investment into the city plot, but they had to give in when Mary threatened to have the president's body moved to a vault in Washington, D.C. On May 23, 1865, after 5 weeks of mourning in a home that is no longer hers, Mary finally departed the White House to make room for the new president, Andrew Johnson, and his family. She settled in Chicago, Illinois with her 2 surviving sons, Robert, who was 22 years old, and Tad, who was 12. She did not went back to live in their old house in Springfield, Illinois, where she remained the legal owner of their property since she already burned bridges with the city officials, and she also didn't want to be someplace where she would again be bombarded by the memories of her deceased husband. Though United States was a nation of widows in 1865, Mary Lincoln was the first widow of an assassinated president. Like many widows, she was overcome by loss and had to adjust to a decreased income. Until Abraham Lincoln's estate was settled, she was limited to an allowance of $1,500 per year. To pay off bills from before the assassination, she asked her son's former tutor to seek donations from businessmen and politicians. In December 1865, Congress voted to give her the $25,000 Abraham would have earned that year had he lived. In 1867, Mary asked her dressmaker Elizabeth Keckley to help carry out a bold plan to sell a portion of her White House wardrobe. The old clothes scandal resulted in negative publicity and little money. Mary recovered when Abraham's estate was settled, and she received $36,000 in cash and securities. After the marriage of her son Robert in 1868, Mary and Tad sailed for Europe and set up a home base in Frankfurt, Germany. While Tad attended school, Mary traveled in Germany and France. In the summer of 1869, they visited Paris, London, Scotland, and Belgium. Around this time, though, she was shocked when her dressmaker and confidant, self-emancipated businesswoman Elizabeth Keckley published a memoir about her time working in the White House. Mary was particularly angry that Elizabeth had included private letters in the book. She felt betrayed by her friend, although they later reconciled. Around this time also, when Mary followed the efforts of friends in Congress to secure her a pension like those given to Civil War soldiers' widows, she wrote letters to congressmen and asked others to work on her behalf. In July 1870, Congress approved an annual pension of $3,000. A year later, her youngest son, Tad, died from a disease of the lungs after the return trip from Europe. Mary was beyond devastated, plunging once more into deep depression. For the next few years, she traveled in the United States and Canada, occasionally visited spiritualists in hopes of communicating with her lost loved ones. Over the next few years, Mary became obsessed with the health of her remaining son, Robert. She also began to suspect that she was the victim of schemes to ruin her life and happiness. Given her personal history, these concerns were not entirely unwarranted, but Robert grew concerned with her erratic behavior. While sightseeing in Florida in 1875, Mary had a premonition that led to one of the most controversial periods in her life. Convinced that her son Robert was ill, she rushed to Chicago, where the healthy Robert began to question his mother's mental health. After observing her and consulting with doctors and friends, he decided that she needed to be placed in an asylum where she could rest and recover. The Illinois law required a jury trial to determine insanity, so Robert took his mother to court in May 1875. The trial lasted 3 hours. Witnesses for the prosecution testified that Mary shopped excessively, complained about strange pains, and obsessed about imagined dangers. A jury of 12 men ruled her insane and appointed Robert as conservator of her estate. Mary, who did not know about the trial until that day, sat quietly through the proceedings. The next day, Robert took Mary to Bellevue Place Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. During her 3-month involuntary stay there, she fought fiercely to regain her freedom, smuggling letters to her lawyers with the help of some staffs. In 1876, Elizabeth's husband defended Mary in a second hearing with the jury, that declared her restored to reason. Mary survived this attack on her personal liberty, but the episode drove a deep wedge between her and her only surviving son. They did not speak again for many years. The debate about Mary Todd Lincoln's mental health that began in 1875 continues today. At the time, some observers acknowledged her unusual behavior but opposed her hospitalization. Others have attributed her behavior to medical conditions and the drugs used to treat her. Historians continue to argue whether Mary was a victim of disease, mental illness, an unhappy son, or the medical and legal systems of the time. In September 1876, Mary sailed for Europe and lived in Pau, France for some years, a foreign country where she speaks the language fluently. After hurting her back in a fall, she returned to the United States in 1880. Plagued by pain and poor vision, and possibly diabetes and arthritis, Mary stayed in 2 rooms in her sister Elizabeth's home in Springfield. She lobbied for an increase in her pension in 1881. For this, she was criticized once again for what many viewed as frivolous spending. After suffering through this latest round of public humiliation, Congress granted her a pension increase and gave her a monetary gift as well. Mary spent the last year of her life living with her sister in Springfield, where her remarkable life's journey had begun. On the anniversary of her youngest son Tad's death, Mary collapsed and slipped into a coma. She died the next day on July 16, 1882 at the age of 63. One biographer has suggested that Mary would have been pleased with her funeral. Springfield businesses were closed during the funeral and hundreds of people lined up to attend the service. 3 ministers conducted the service in a church decorated with elaborate floral arrangements. After the service, the mourners traveled to Oak Ridge Cemetery, where Mary Todd Lincoln was laid to rest with her beloved husband. Historians have not been kind to Mary Todd Lincoln, portraying her as an influence peddler, extortionist, overspender, erratic, and even crazy. What about you guys? What do you think of Mary Todd Lincoln? Well, if I'm to put myself in her situation, I strongly believe that she had done the best she could given the circumstances she was born and lived with in the early 19th century. I mean, losing your mother at a tender age, living with debilitating migraines with no exact known cause and treatment up to this day, going through depression and losing your 3 beloved sons to illness, witnessing the shooting and death of your husband you consider your all, and finally being accused publicly by your own son as insane? Well, I know some women, even men, wouldn't even know how to go back from there. I would say maybe she could be spiteful, maybe corrupt. I don't know for sure, I wasn't there. She could also be jealous. I mean, who isn't? But Mary Lincoln, for me, could also be gracious, entertaining, passionate, goal-oriented, caring, and supportive. I would be browsing comment section down below for your reactions soon. I'm so excited to hear from all of you. Bye!